Hey guys, Sean from Top 5 Fit here. Want to go over a fairly popular exercise. It's been kind of around for a while, but comes and goes in the industry as far as popularity is concerned. Kettlebells, kettlebell training. A great set of exercises to add to your training arsenal, your training regimen. Before we get into this, a couple of side notes real quick. One, I'm not kettlebell certified. I like the exercises. I like what they have to offer, and sometimes they work in some of my clients, their programs. Sometimes it doesn't. So, having said that, there are some things that you're going to want to pay attention to before you start engaging in kettlebell training. One, make sure your joint mobility is where it's supposed to be. You're basically doing a sort of weight training and cardio at the same time, and there's gravitational forces being placed on your joints while you're doing some of these movements. So if you've already got some areas that are not quite as mobile as they could be, or even worse, not feeling quite right, consistent aches and pains, these are things you may want to address before engaging in some of these movements. So just kind of keep that in mind before we get started. The other thing is to try not to be too quote unquote meat-headed with the weight and the load that you're using. Again, you're swinging around weight, so we're going to be adding momentum to 25, 35, 45 pound kettlebells. You're going to want to make sure that control is kind of what you have with that weight before you start actually moving it. So if you grab something too heavy and you put all your body weight behind it, and next thing you know, the kettlebell's up above your head and you lose control, that could create a bad scenario. So try to be a little bit more modest and respectful with the weight that you're using with these exercises. All right. Having said that, let's go ahead and take a look at the first exercise, kettlebell swing throughs. You want to start with your kettlebell. I like to grab hands on. Now, first, side note, my kettlebells might not look like everybody else's kettlebells. These are competition kettlebells, so they core out the bottom of them. That's how they actually change the weight of these. So you don't really have to adjust to a different size kettlebell. It's just a different weight. The ones with the bull horns, which are much more popular, it almost looks more like a triangle on top, and the bell itself is much smaller. Those are the ones that Pavel uses, if you're familiar with Pavel and certification courses. But these are things that, again, it's kind of up to the user. I chose these because I didn't want to have to worry about my clientele adjusting to different size kettlebells during the movement, so we just went with these. Doesn't mean either one's better or not, but it's just what's going on here. So start off with feet about shoulder width apart, a little bit wider, toes slightly turned out. You're going to grip the kettlebell, palms towards you and thumbs almost touching. All right. Sometimes you can run the little fingers down the sides. That's a comfort thing. That's up to you. But personally, I like to just have as much grip on the top part of that horn, the top part of the kettle as possible. So this particular exercise is a hip hinging and a hip explosion exercise. So a lot of times we'll see people get real deep down into their squats, and then they want to stand up and use the squat to actually push the kettlebell up. Kind of the right idea, but there's too much work happening at the knees. Ideally, you want to focus more on utilizing the glutes in that posterior chain to actually create enough momentum to push the kettlebell up in front of you. So instead of taking it so deep, I'm going to almost take my butt back just a little bit. And then at the very top, as I shrug and lift through the shoulders, almost like a front raise, but not really. Because if you get to the point where all you're doing is lifting that kettlebell, you're missing the point of the activity. This is a momentum-based activity, an explosion-based exercise. So you want to make sure you're not just isolating your shoulders and lifting the kettlebell. You want to actually start the movement with your hip thrust. So here, squeeze through the glutes. Make sure you're bringing the kettlebell about shoulder width height or shoulder height, parallel to the floor, and then right back down. On the descent, when you're bringing that kettlebell back down, you want to start back in that reloaded position. Okay, so I'm here ready to absorb that weight as it comes down and then squeeze and follow through to push it right back up into the next rep. Another variation off of the kettlebell swing through is a switch grip kettlebell swing through. And this is a point where we're actually just going to change from right hand to left hand and back. All of the same rules for the kettlebell swing through as far as hinging through the hips, making sure that you're actually firing the glutes, not really taking the kettlebell above parallel to the ground, shoulder height. All of those rules apply. The only difference is we're actually going to switch from the right to the left. Now, I like to actually start one-handed instead of two, because that way I know right at the top of the first rep I have to switch grips. So ideally here, and you can pretty much place this opposite hand wherever you're comfortable. I have a tendency to drop it down. The RKCers will actually put a hand out and leave that there. But once you initiate the movement, the idea is you're going to have to get your hand up parallel to the ground and replace that grip on the kettlebell parallel to the ground. Any other point in the swing, you're going to add rotation to the kettlebell, and ultimately it could just drop and hit the ground. So ideally, as we swing, I'm going to switch right at the top. Right at the top. Hinge at the hips, switch parallel to the floor. One thing to emphasize, making sure that it's just a release and not a flip. The minute you drop your hand or push your thumb up, you'll add rotation to that kettlebell and the grip starts spinning in midair, and it's a lot harder to re-grab with the opposite hand. So you want to make sure, release, re-grab, release, re-grab. And I'm not adding any unnecessary spin to that kettlebell while I'm doing that. Another variation off of the kettlebell swing through is actually taking the kettlebell all the way above your head. This adds emphasis to the front delts, basically your shoulders, as well as stabilization and control in your lats. So the movement is going to be the exact same as your kettlebell swing through. So we're focusing on hip hinge, thrust through the glutes, standing up nice and straight, arms parallel to the ground. Now the difference is we're not going to start arms parallel to the ground, we're going to take them all the way above the head. So we sit, swing, up tall, all the way above the head. Now, why would somebody want to add that extra bit of extension at the shoulders and take the kettlebell all the way above the head? The idea is adding that, the explosion that you're actually generating by getting the kettlebell even up to parallel, we're now adding control and stability by taking the kettlebell above the head, maintaining tension across the glutes and the low back. This will add stability to basically any and all functional movements that you may have to do. And it also gets that posterior chain communicating a little bit better. You're not really going to find it too easy to stabilize a kettlebell above your head without firing hamstrings, glutes, low back, and even your lats at the same time. Okay, next exercise we want to take a look at is the kettlebell clean. So ideally, we'll grab with one hand, feet a little wider than shoulder width apart, toes out. What you want to think about doing is pulling that kettlebell in close to the body. I see a lot of times in the gym, people have a tendency to start by bringing that kettlebell all the way out here and then trying to flip underneath it. We're not trying to destroy the shoulder. We're not trying to beat up the back of the arm. So you want to make sure that you're actually pulling that kettlebell as close to the body, elbow up high as you possibly can. So here, nice and close and tight to the structure. If it's out too far, again, we're putting undue stress on the shoulder. The second part of that is the catch. Here, I like to think of driving my hand through the kettlebell. So ideally, I'm catching the majority of the weight right there, base of the thumb, heel of the hand, but I'm driving my finger straight up at the same time. This helps me control the amount of pressure that the kettlebell is actually putting on the back of my arm. If you get a little lax in the wrist, you start really banging into the back of your arm, and that doesn't feel good. You'll take a couple of whacks and you won't do this exercise at all. So ideally, focusing on pulling in through the body, nice and tight, switch, rotate that wrist, driving the fingers up towards the ceiling at the same time. All right, another variation off of the kettlebell clean is a kettlebell clean with a press, and I use a push press method to actually get the kettlebell up and above my head. Now, a couple of things to note with this. We've already cleaned and got the kettlebell into position. Now, the jury's kind of out on whether or not this is good form or not. I tend to not like this body positioning only because I like to try to stay as balanced as possible with my clients from right to left. I have a tendency to see some people actually sink their torso to hold and absorb. So when you look at them from the side, there's actually this kind of thing going on, where the weight is almost trying to be centered over top of the hip and the ribs and the shoulder are jutted out to the side. I like to maintain posture. A lot of times people who hold this position have a tendency to kind of start that momentum from their core, and they're almost doing it as a rotational component out of the waistline. That frightens me, especially when I'm showing these exercises to clients who have back issues. I like to make sure that posture is nice and straight. So literally my head is right over top of my hips. That kettlebell is nice and tight to the body. I'm driving fingers towards the ceiling. Now, as far as the press is concerned, the push press part of it originates out of my hips and knees. So I'll actually sit and extend straight up. As I extend, I actually rotate that palm towards you, the viewer, so that I can get that kettlebell straight above my head. And then I will rotate back out to bring it right back down to that starting position. Sit, explode through the hips, place right over top of the head, bicep close to the ear, and then rotate it back out, starting position. Okay, those are 5 great basic beginner level kettlebell exercises to get started with. Some great points to kind of focus on so that you're actually developing the explosive power that you're looking for. Again, make sure your joints are intact, make sure things are mobile, make sure things feel good before you start swinging weight around. It does take a little bit of a toll on the body, so you want to make sure that structurally you're sound before you start adding these in. If you like what you saw, make sure and let us know in the comment box. If there's anything else you'd like us to cover, let us know that as well. Don't forget to hit subscribe because there's going to be more videos to come. Thanks again.